right, we're going to call our August workshop to order. Declaration of a quorum, 7 members. Welcome, everybody. Special welcome to Dr. Payne. Brings us to item C, hearing of citizens. Ms. Horn, no. Brings us to item D1, consideration, discussion, possible action related to naming TASB delegate and alternate for 2022 TASB Delegate Assembly. Ms. McAdams, I believe you served in this role last year for us. I believe in a role that you're serving now. You mentioned that it is recommended. What did they say? Help me out with that.
Yeah, if y'all remember back, I think it was February or March when we started with the grassroots meeting in Huntsville. I got picked to be the region rep for the Legislative Advisory Council, and then through the work with that in Austin, they just said, since you've kind of gone through that whole process, you should recommend to your board that you finish out the year with being the delegate again at the conference in September.
That's what I was going to recommend.
I don't see anyone fighting you over there, Ms. McAdams.
Well, I'd love to have a good backup who wants to come with me.
So we do need to appoint a delegate. Do we have anybody that is of interest to do that?
You mean an assistant one, or what is it called?
Yeah.
Alternate.
Alternate, sorry.
Alternate, that's the word. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Josh.
Oh, I was going to move to appoint Ms. McAdams.
I would like to be the alternate. I like doing it.
It's
So
not that we don't like
no one
it.
else is fighting me for it.
Anyone? Anyone else?
It's an interesting learning experience.
Blaine, or do we need speeches from each of y'all, or how do y'all want to do that? You're okay, okay. All right. Well, then we would just need a motion.
So moved. Second.
All right, we have a motion by Mr. Ben, second by Mr. Hall. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. Motion carries 7-0. Ms. McAdams will serve as our delegate, and Ms. Nolan will serve as our alternate. Thank y'all very much.
And just a reminder to the group, TASB begins the evening, I guess, is the reception Thursday, September 22nd. It's in San Antonio, and it will run through the course of the day that Friday, the 23rd, Saturday, the 24th, and wrap up the morning of Sunday, the 25th. So just a reminder to keep your calendars penciled in for that time. Also, if I see Chuck kind of looking at us, just remember your microphone, if you will, whenever we're speaking, so we can pick it up on the recording. Thank you.
All right, that'll bring us to item 2, consideration and discussion regarding TASB policy update 119. Mr. Martindale.
Thank you, Mr. Horak and board members. Dr. Perry last month gave us our first reading of policy update 119. So she's going to give us a brief overview with this second reading. This is an action item on the regular agenda tonight at 7 p.m. So with additional details or just a quick overview of what we discussed last month in the first reading is our Chief Administrative Officer and Deputy Superintendent, Dr. Molly Perry. It's like official doctor now, right?
Official.
All right.
As official as it gets. Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Martindale, Mr. Horak, members of the board. As shared previously, we have had an opportunity to not only discuss this at the July workshop, but you've received it in transmittal. And these are policy updates as recommended by the Texas Association of School Boards related to the special legislative session that happened in our prior session. So there are items related to things such as records management, looking at required professional development, as well as some just basic instructional material information as required by state law for child abuse prevention, along with some provisions that were taken from policy related to gifted and talented students due to some changes in statutory requirements, as well as other professional development related policy. With that, I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have related to Update 119.
anything? All right. We will move on. Thank you very much. That'll bring us to item 3, consideration discussion regarding recommended updates to policy FNCE. Mr. Martindale.
Thank you, Mr. Warwick. This is a first reading. There's no particular action on this this evening, but Dr. Perry is going to review recommended local changes to policy FNCE. Dr. Perry.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Martindale. We are coming to the board with some discussion around policy FNCE related to personal telecommunications and electronic devices. And the origin of this particular recommendation really comes from several requests that we've received over the course of the last year or so related to tracking devices for students with special needs. While those provisions are not specific to the policy, it would apply to any student. I wanted to make it very clear that that is really where the origin has come from. We do, of course, have students with special needs who are unable to effectively communicate and sometimes will elope from the area in which is safe. Of course, we have lots of measures to keep them safe at school, including additional personnel, monitoring, behavior plans, et cetera. But oftentimes families will opt into using tracking devices not only for safety while at school, but in the community, in the home. And so with these requests, we've had conversations around the fact that these devices often also include a listen-in or a recording capability. And so that does present concerns related to privacy in the classroom and being able to hear other students and things of that nature. And so we are recommending that we have conversation around adding this additional provision for student tracking devices so that should a parent have their child wear this device and due to those privacy concerns that we would prohibit any unauthorized audio or visual recordings or transmission of audio or other images of students. So it would require that parent to visit with the principal and obtain their approval before operating those devices on campus so that we're all very informed and on the same page regarding the use. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And again, as Mr. Martindale stated, this is not for action this evening.
So this is to, if I'm understanding this correctly, this is to protect the other students in the classroom and the other students that they're interacting with during the day.
Exactly. This provides some provision so that we would have that communication between the parent and the family so that we're all very clear regarding the use of the listen-in. At this point, the devices that we've encountered typically have the ability to turn that function off or on, and so we're certainly not prohibiting the use of the device if that's something that the student always wears. We just want to ensure that we're protecting the privacy of other students by not having the listen-in capability on while at school.
I guess just to follow on that, so, because this really just says they have to get approval, right?
Correct.
So, I mean, you think if they are, the intention, they could be approved to have one in the classroom, but then how do we protect the privacy of the other students?
Right, so that's where that conversation with the principal and the parent comes in terms of really looking at the specifics of that device, the capabilities, and that agreement between the parent and the principal regarding how it would be used.
So it's possible that device could not be allowed or it would be limited?
It's possible.
Right.
Were you asking in regards to the other students, not the students that are using the device?
Yes, exactly, right.
So how did, I guess, the privacy of the other students, would those parents need to be notified of this as well?
So the intention behind this is that through that conversation with the parent, we would come to agreement that in order to allow the device, we would not have the listen-in capability turned on at school.
I got you, okay.
Yeah, because just, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way this is written, they could get approval to use the device, but at no time could the listen-in technology be not disabled
While at school.
at school. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
It's more of a management question, but is this going to be written approval?
That would be part of an administrative guideline
Okay.
related to any sort of written agreement between the parent and the school.
And I know, I mean, this is our language, right, that we're adding in? This is.
Exactly. So the language is being proposed via TASB policy consultant, but
Okay.
at our request, because we have had an increasing number of parents who are obtaining devices. And so we just want to make it very clear from a whole district perspective that our stance is that the concern is not with wearing the device, but with the listen and technology, and that aspect would be disabled while on campus.
So I guess it goes back to the first statement, approval from the principal. The assumption to me is that the teacher would also know about this.
Absolutely.
So I don't know if that would need to be put in there or if it's,
So,
I don't know, attorney.
I think that would probably go back to the administrative guidelines in terms of
gotcha.
the principal coordinating with the teacher, but the approval
Yep.
from a policy perspective would
That makes
happen at the campus principal level.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be the application or management thereof, the policy, which would be administrative procedure. And Mr. Hall had an excellent point. What I would anticipate is that we have a standard formalized process to capture it in writing that everyone could use.
Okay. Anything else?
I guess one other districts that have similar policies, does this language kind of track what they have?
Exactly, yes, as recommended by TASB.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That'll bring us to item 4, consideration, discussion, possible action related to the 2022-23 budget and tax rate. Mr. Martindale.
Thank you, Mr. Horak and board members. This is the first of, should I say, several times we'll hear from Ms. Strauss throughout the course of this evening. No, the first of 3. So she'll take us through our proposed budget and tax rate here in just a few minutes. It's information that you've seen many times before. We have a public hearing on that at 6:40, which is required by law. And then this will be up for board consideration and action at our regular meeting at 7 o'clock. So with additional details, our Chief Financial Officer, Ms. Amy Strauss.
Thank you, Mr. Martindale, members of the board. I'm not sure what I'm going to talk about next workshop. It seems like we've done this 5 or 6 times in a row, so.
We'll find something, Ms. Strauss.
I'm sure we'll find something, right. So first of all, kind of what we're going to go over tonight is the budget adoption requirements. We touched briefly on those last time, but we're coming to the end with the adoption tonight, so I wanted to touch on that. The proposed budget for next year, and as well as the proposed tax rate. We'll look at debt service one more time, and then a summary of our recommendations for the budget that'll be presented a little bit later. So first of all, the budget and tax rate adoption requirements. So we must propose a budget to you as a Board of Trustees by August 20th. That budget must include at a minimum at the function level, the general fund, the debt service fund, and the child nutrition fund. So as you know, there are many other funds, particularly special revenue funds and some others, but they are for a specific purpose. So you do not have to adopt those budgets. So a public hearing on the budget and tax rate must be planned and published, and that's scheduled for later this evening as well. A summary of that budget must be posted on the district's website. That was done at the same time that the public hearing was advertised. So we can adopt that budget and tax rate at the same or separate meetings, but the budget must come first before the tax rate. So the item in red is new. It's new this year, and it also is added to the list from the last meeting, and that's the tax rate calculations must be posted with the budget and/or the tax rate information. So if you'll recall a few meetings ago, you as a Board of Trustees delegated that responsibility of making these tax rate calculations to the tax collector and assessor. She has done that for many years for us and is very knowledgeable. So those must be attached to the budget, and it is tonight. So if the board adopts a tax rate above the district's voter-approved or compressed tax rate, as we like to call it, we must hold an election for the voters to approve that rate. And August 22nd is the deadline for that. And then lastly, once all of this is adopted, must be filed on the district's website as well as with TEA. So kind of looking forward to next year's budget, 22-23, we've based that on an enrollment of 14,689. That's about 3.5% above what our snapshot date was this past year. And that calculates to an average daily attendance of 13,325. That's using about a 95% attendance rate. That attendance rate is better than we've had last year after the pandemic. We all know attendance was not where it had been, but it's still a little bit lower than pre-pandemic. So we're kind of taking a middle of the road position with that. And then our property value growth, 10.7%. Now that is after we took that additional homestead exemption of 15,000. So it was really hard. It's hard to compare apples to apples at this point because of that. But if we added that back in, we are right about where we were estimating at about 11.5 to 11.7%. So for the proposed budget, the tax rate calculations that we used, we calculated that compressed rate. And if you'll recall, as Board of Trustees, you've authorized 5 cents, which is what is allowed without that voter approval in previous years. We've added that to there. So our maintenance and operations rate that's used for the proposed budget is 88.5 cents and a little bit of change. Keeping the debt rate the same it was, so that would be $1.1481 total for those two funds. That is about 6.7 cents lower than our tax rate last year. And as a reminder, we must lower our tax rate if our property values are growing more than about 2.5%. So that's that forced compression. That's what we're going to prepare our budget on. So in summary, here are the three funds that we're required to adopt. The general fund is the only one here that is not in a balanced budget situation, with proposed revenue of $130,763,894 and appropriations $132.2 million plus some change there. So the net effect would be appropriations exceeding revenue of $1.5 million, $14,276. Debt service and child nutrition are both estimated to be balanced budgets, and for a total of $169,070,430 in revenue and $170,584,706 in total appropriations. Those are the three required budgeted funds. So to highlight some of the additions that are included in those appropriations for the general fund, if you'll recall in June, you as a Board of Trustees approved a compensation plan. You actually approved two compensation plans, and we'll talk about the second one in a little while, but compensation plan A increased the beginning teacher pay to $47,725, and it included a 2% salary increase for all of our pay groups. The teachers, librarians, registered nurses, and all of the other ones are based on midpoint. We had some additional positions for special education due to program growth. Our career and technology education continues to grow, so we have some increased expenditures there to support that program and to meet our spend requirements as well. So I think new from the last time is 2 additional school resource deputies to be added to the current ones that we have. That will take a little while to get advertised and posted with the county because it will go through there. But we have added 2 resource deputies. We have inflation, of course. We've all felt the fuel inflation, but we also have some contractual agreements. The school resource deputies, Brazos County Appraisal District, property and casualty, and software, those make up the largest of those categories. And then some other miscellaneous supplies and expenses that accommodate our student growth.
So for the Brazos County Appraisal District, is that operating fees or is that based on our property value?
It's based on property values.
So they don't get compressed because of the increase in property?
Right.
Okay.
So they take their budget and they divide that amongst the jurisdictions that they serve based on property values. So that's how that's divided up. So then to talk about the proposed tax rate. So we just talked about the rate that supported that proposed budget, but you'll see that last column there. So administration, we're proposing a tax rate that's 3 cents higher than what we used to prepare the budget with. And all of that 3 cents is on the maintenance and operations side, bringing it to 91.51 cents. So that takes a total tax rate for a decline of 3.71 cents from 21-22 as opposed to 6.7. So that proposed rate in the last column is 3.7 cents lower than current. But because that does exceed what we call the voter approved or that compressed tax rate calculation, it will require that a voter approved tax rate election, that order be approved by the board and then it be taken to the voters for a November election.
On that 6 cents, the state's not taking that 6 cents, it just evaporates if we don't pass the TRE.
What do you
If
mean
you
by
go back one
taking it?
slide, so that drop, it's just not collected,
It's
so it
not collected.
disappears.
It's just not collected.
So our property values increase because people want to live here. But then we just lose money to generate the revenue.
So you're allowed about a 2.5% property value growth. Beyond that, then you're required to compress your tax rate to make up that difference.
Okay.
That came along with House Bill 3, I think in 2019. Okay. So just kind of another way to look at that and looking at the picture that the blue arrow shows what would happen with the tax rate with just that compression. And then the right arrow, the green, is with the voter approved tax rate election where it's going down 3.7 cents from the 21-22 rate. So what would that 3 cents mean to College Station ISD in the way of revenue? So looking at that, 3 cents would bring us about $3.3 million of additional tax revenues, but it will also bring us about $1.7 million in state monies. So the state, up to a certain tax rate, does contribute funds. Now, this is the highest that it will contribute on. If we went 4 cents, there would not be any additional state revenue. So you're looking at a little bit over $5 million, 1.6 million, almost 1.7 million on a per penny basis. Also approved in June, we talked about that compensation B. So if this were to pass, based on a resolution that the Board of Trustees did approve, that we would use these additional funds not only to balance the budget, but also to initiate what we called Compensation Plan B. Okay, so Compensation Plan B would take the beginning teacher pay to $49,600. It would provide an additional 4% from their base pay for teachers, librarians, registered nurses. Also an additional 4% of midpoint for all the other pay groups with the exception of administrators, which would be 2%. Those would be retroactive to the beginning of the contract year.
And if you, will you go back one slide, Amy? And I know this group knows this, but just as a reminder, is this, the reason for the plan B and the idea for the TRE is that we are tracking behind relative to pay to our comparable districts. Staffing is vital. Quality of staff we have excellent people. This would allow us to compensate those that we have, retain, recruit in a more competitive market. It would just allow us to shift our salary schedules to be more conducive in ensuring that we have the best staff possible, and we're hanging on to the top-notch people that we have in the process.
Correct. and protecting fund balance in the process. So the order calling voter approval tax rate, so because it exceeds that rate, or that compressed rate that we talked about, that election, if you so approve tonight, would take place on November 8th, with early voting beginning October 24th, would be the early voting time period. So I want to visit a little bit about, I'm sorry.
I was just going to ask, so thanks for really explaining that the budget we would approve would be with the Plan A compensation, right?
Correct.
And then, but then if we ask for the voters to do the VATRE and that it gets approved, will we have to do another budget or a budget amendment? How does that?
Yes, so what we would do would be follow that election, once everything is canvassed, with a budget amendment that would add the additional revenue as well as the additional expenses for compensation B, Plan B.
And I apologize if you were going to get to that.
That's okay.
All right.
That's all right. So upon the order, the resolution, there is a section in there that says what the ballot language would look like. And it's a little confusing because you're going to see some very different numbers than what we just talked about. But it talks about that this will result in an increase of 6.07% in maintenance and operations tax revenue from the current year, so that being 21-22, with an additional $6.5 million plus a little bit. So those numbers are different, and I want to explain why. So when we talked about the $5 million and the 3 cents, what we're looking at is the additional revenue that would be generated based from the 22-23 proposed rate. So that's got 2.5% of your property value growth calculated in there. So I'm just looking at the additional revenue it would add to the budget for 22-23. This particular ballot language wants to look at just the maintenance or the general operation, general fund side, and how much additional property tax revenue we would collect from 21-22 to 22-23. So it's got the 2.5% growth that we are allowed, plus it's got the 3 cents. So it's going back. And that 6% is actually, it's based on a calculation of what's called the no new revenue rate. And that is what tax rate, which is, you're not going to see that rate anywhere on here, but what tax rate would be required to collect the same amount of revenue on the properties that we had last year. So no new properties added. So what tax rate, assuming same property from last year, would it take? So that's why that 6% is there. So, before I was talking about the additional revenue to the proposed upcoming budget, and this is comparing it to last year.
So this is different than bond language because there's not that all caps information then loaded across the bottom below the
Correct.
ballot language, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
But how set in stone is this language?
Very.
Because unfortunately, I know there's legal requirements, but it only tells half the story,
That's correct.
it seems like.
So the other half of
Second.
the story can probably come when we start, when we start sharing the factual information on our website and to various groups, that we will share the factual information and have some things that we can share with them. But the ballot language and what you can put in there is very specific.
Do we have any
We have
English
our legal
majors?
counsel behind me as well. Pardon?
Do we have any English majors on staff?
We have a couple over there, actually. Here, if the board acts on this at a regular meeting later this evening, it becomes our responsibility to communicate ballot language and the facts that accompany this. The facts that accompany this is if it's approved, we'll be able to provide additional compensation for our employees, thus making our teacher pay schedules more competitive to our comparable districts. That's a fact. And that would become our responsibility to communicate and educate voters so that they could, so they have all the facts when they make a decision on how they vote in November.
I find it interesting, it doesn't say it's increasing the tax rate, which is what the bonds had said. It actually says it's a 6.07%, and the M&O tax revenue increases the
And that is 21-22 to
Compared to-
22-23, right?
My worry is, and that's why what Mr. Ben was saying, I wonder if we could point out that it's a change from 1.21 to 1.178. Okay. But yeah.
We're going to be speaking to bond counsel
Okay.
later in executive at the regular meeting, and I see him here now. So feel free in executive this evening to ask him all these questions that you would like regarding language. But again, and again, a difference though is, and you're all familiar with this, when we had the four props for the bond, included with that, again, in all caps, is this is a property tax increase across the bottom. This reads differently, so I think it now, and again, if the board takes action later this evening, becomes our responsibility to educate our voters and ask and answer clarifying questions from them through the process up to the election. And again, the fact is if approved, the additional revenue will go toward compensating our employees. That is a fact, and that's what this boils down to.
Just a quick side note, by the way, the language on bonds and ballot issues is one of the Legislative Advisory Council's items that they are trying to push with the legislature. We'll see if they have any luck this January, but.
I hope they do. It's
yeah.
very confusing.
This is very technical, but does it matter that there's a percent symbol and then the word percent? 6.07% and then percent?
I'll have to ask legal counsel on that one. Yeah, there's both. Yeah, it's kind of redundant, so we'll see if we can fix that. Yeah, emphasis. So just a little bit on debt service, just to show you the principal and interest payments, as well as related fees that come along with those. That makes up the $30,703,865. So these are scheduled debt payments for next year. It's been accounted for in that rate that we proposed. I didn't show you food service, but it's a balanced budget, and it hasn't changed from last time. So in summary, we have prepared a budget that includes the three funds that's required. In that budget, compensation plan A is part of those numbers. The revenue in that proposed budget is the calculated compressed tax rate for the general fund and the current tax rate that we currently have for the debt service fund, resulting in a 6.7 cent reduction from the 21-22. That's in the proposed budget. The tax rate that's going to be proposed later tonight for adoption by a resolution is 3 cents higher than that calculated rate for the proposed budget. So that would result in 3.7 cents lower than 21-22. An order calling for the voter-approved tax rate election will be presented tonight for consideration. And if so approved, then the election would occur on November 8th. And if the VATRE passes, then an amended budget will be presented that recognizes that additional revenue as well as the expenses for compensation plan B.
And just to clarify your statement, that amended budget would have both the Plan B raises and it would be a balanced.
At this point,
Budget.
that's what the
That's the
estimates are, that it would balance the 1.5, which is basically caused with compensation plan A, and then compensation
And
plan B.
still do Plan B
Yes,
compensation.
it's estimated that it can balance that budget. So just the timeline, so you can see we're finally at the end. The August 16th is tonight, so we'll hold our public hearing in a little bit and then propose everything for adoption. So finally at the end. Yeah. So I'll entertain any other questions you might have.
Amy, thank you very much. And I know we'll hear from you several times
You might see
again
the
this
same
evening.
slides if you.
However, I just want to thank you. It's been a very lengthy process and complex process, and you have done a wonderful job over that time in explaining and clarifying to us as a collective group. So we appreciate your work in getting us to this point, while we still have 2 more meetings to get to the finish line.
Yeah.
Appreciate your work up to this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That brings us to item 5, consideration and discussion regarding the 2022 assessment and accountability results. Mr. Martindale.
With an initial look at our STAR and EOC results from the spring of 2022 is our Deputy Superintendent and Chief Administrative Officer, Dr. Molly Perry.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Martindale. Mr. Horak. Members of the board, it has been a few years since we really spent a lengthy period of time on this particular presentation. In fact, it was 2019 when we last had ratings assigned from the state of Texas. And so this evening I may go a little more slowly than I might otherwise, just because we might need to dust it off and especially make sure our newer board members are up to speed on how these systems work and what these results mean for College Station ISD. And so with that, I want to start with a recap, and then we'll move into an overview of student performance on the assessments. So one of the probably more significant changes for the 22 testing year had to do with the change of vendor. Every several years, the Texas Education Agency, or TEA, will go out and determine whether or not they will continue with their existing testing vendor or they might make a change. And so they had been with ETS for several years and selected Cambium as their new platform for the STAR exams. Now, Pearson is a well-known name in testing, and they are still involved in STAR. However, their involvement really is on the test design and question formulation side, whereas Cambium is really more the platform. And that will become even more important as we move into the redesign of STAR for the following, or the upcoming school year, I should say at this point, when we go fully online with those assessments as part of the redesign. So some other changes for this past year were out of the most recent legislative session. Previously, students in grades 5 and 8 would have 3 opportunities to pass those math and reading assessments. Those retesting requirements were eliminated. However, the introduction of House Bill 45 introduced a whole new slew of requirements for students who did not meet requirements on assessments. So we had a little bit of a trade-off there. And writing assessments in grades 4 and 7 were eliminated completely in 2022. However, we will see those integrated into reading assessments in grades 3 through 8 in the upcoming year. So because of the last year for this particular design and version of STAR, we didn't see a whole lot of changes in the assessments otherwise. And really overall, from the student experience perspective, it went really well. However, on the back end, we had a lot of difficulties with ensuring that our student data not only was in the system correctly, but stayed in the system correctly, because there would be overwrites of the data, and our district testing coordinator, Ms. Sherry Hendrick, spent countless hours going in and verifying and adjusting and working with those campus testing coordinators to ensure that we had everything as accurate as possible. And so we continued to have those difficulties throughout the summer, even most recently in the last few weeks, with a whole new data file coming in at the very end of July. And so we did have some delays in getting those results because we were continuing to get new files. And so as we talk about results tonight, tonight, know that they're preliminary, and oftentimes preliminary is pretty well final, but I'm not so sure this year. So we'll see. But parents can access those results online. We sent an email out to all of our parents listed as the primary contact, and then we do have those paper copies available as well. If there are parents still out there that have not received their child's results, they can go to the campus where they took that exam to pick up that copy.
Just to clarify the issues, were you saying, are those vendor issues or issues with us in CSISD?
They were issues with the vendor being able to
What I figured.
get the
Statewide.
accurate
Yes,
information to us. Yes, that was TEA's vendor, just issues with data integrity and then rescoring and sending updated and newer results along the way. All right. So as a reminder, for passing standards, this is not necessarily just a pass-fail assessment. Students receive a passing standard of approaches. That means they passed, meets grade level. It's a little higher standard, still passed, and master's, of course, is the highest level. A parent would know, looking at their student's report, that they did not pass only if it says did not meet grade level. And so as we look at results, we'll be looking at those 3 levels of passing standard this evening. So we'll start with reading for our grade 3-8 students. And at first, we'll just take a quick glance at the percentage of our students who met that passing standard relative to the state, with College Station ISD students being in what looks like red on this particular screen and the state being in blue. And what you'll notice here right away is across each of the grade levels from 3 through 8 that our students' performance exceeded the rates of the state. We'll dig a little more deeply, and I want to just take a moment on the first slide and kind of acclimate you, because there are several colors and a number of bars. So I think it's really important as we are coming out on the other side of the pandemic to really look and see how do we fare, kind of a pre-test, post-test look, if you will, to where students were prior to. And so 2019 was the last year that we had a typical school year in terms of the disruption that we've seen over the last several years. 2019 was a full administration of STAR. We'd had this version in place for a few years at that point. If you'll recall, 2020, there was no administration of STAR at all. That was right after we had the full statewide closure. And then 21, the data is probably not the most valid or reliable, because we had a lot of students, especially across the state, that were still participating in remote learning. Many students who did not take STAR because they opted out while they stayed home and didn't come up to take the exam. And so really this is our first look at kind of what is really the full impact of having students in the state of Texas participate in the exam in 2022. So we've got, again, the state in blue, the district in red, with the lighter colors being the 2019 results, and then the darker being the most recent 2022 results. So you can see right away, statewide, we actually saw a slight gain, going from 76% to 77%, meeting that approaches level. Here in College Station, we were above the state pre-pandemic, and we continue to be, in fact, 4% higher than the state rate for that 3rd grade reading. So I'm going to go ahead and add on those other passing standards, because those are increasingly important as we delve into the accountability system. Many aspects of that system are not just looking at whether or not students pass the assessment, but do they hit that higher standard of meets? And then Masters really gives us a good idea of just how high are our students performing on this assessment. The number of questions that a student can miss and hit that master's levels does vary a little bit depending on the test, but generally it's just a handful of questions in order to hit master's that you can not accurately answer. So that tells us right away that we have a very high number of students who are hitting the highest level. So we've got a repeat of the slide you just saw there on the left, so that we can look side by side at our elementary reading performance. And what you'll notice probably pretty quickly is that we're seeing very similar trends for 3rd and 4th grade. And those trends do hold as we move through reading. Statewide, we actually saw gains from pre to post-pandemic, and College Station not only started at a higher level, but continued to show those gains across the grade levels in reading, not only at that basic purchase passing standard, but also at those higher standards. So I'm going to move over to intermediate, grades 5 and 6. And again, fifth grade's a little less significant in terms of the difference between the state and here in College Station. But then when we move to sixth grade, we're starting to see that spread a little more in terms of where our students are performing. You can see there in sixth grade reading, we're 10 percentage points higher than the state post-pandemic. So we maintained that growth rate relative to the state before and after.
So it's interesting, pardon me, sorry.
Absolutely.
So going back to that first slide, your 19 third graders are now your 2022 sixth graders. Does that calculate correct?
Correct.
So that's interesting how that trends and how similar they are in the success rate. Because, yeah, I mean, looking at it from a grade level, but then looking at it from the student level of where they were pre-pandemic in third grade to where they are now, sixth grade, and just seeing the growth. And the numbers seem a little higher at grade 6 if I
Well,
saw
and
that
when
right.
we look at the straight numbers, you can see, statewide where we were, and then moving over to sixth grade. I think the other challenging piece of this is that the passing standards do vary not only across assessments, but across grade levels. And so when you look at the number of questions on a test and the number of questions that a student would have to answer correctly in order to hit the passing standard, there's a lot of variance in there. And so we'd have to really dig down to a much more granular level to be able to probably draw conclusions around the cohort. Yeah.
And it's obviously, CSISD looks really good, which is what we like to see. The thing that kind of surprises me so much, though, is how much the state has also moved up on many of these. I mean, like right there, the grade 6 reading for the meets, they went from they rose 7%.
If you look, and it's hard to flip slides, but like Jeff was saying, those correlate with the previous grades and the 3-year skips, and then also it looks like a systematic shift.
Well, there's definitely a systematic shift.
But then we still exceed by really a 3-to-2 ratio across all of them. And I think what's marked about us is that sixth grade to third grade is amazing because they don't have that pronounced impact on the state level because we increased from our approaches to meets.
All good. I mean, I'm not arguing that the CSISD has not outpaced and done well. My question, though, is there any explanation for why the state, under 2 years of pandemic, has made what are pretty extraordinary increases in STAR performance? I mean, as those of us have been watching them for many, many years, that seems like a pretty big jump on from a 19 number to a 22 number.
Well, we definitely know that looking at data from pre and post pandemic, not only with STAR, but also with NWEA MAP, who has nationwide data, that math was more significantly impacted by the disruption. And we'll see that in the data when we shift towards mathematics. But that is really truly the trend that we're seeing across the nation in terms of student performance, is that reading was less impacted. And you would think, for those third graders who in the most formative years of reading instruction, who had those years impacted by closure and then many remote learners, that you wouldn't necessarily see those gains. So it is surprising.
Yeah.
I think there are probably a variety of variables that play into why that might be. I would imagine the commissioner would probably point to things like reading academies and improved reading instruction. But, the bottom line is in this assessment as well as MAP, we are seeing improvements. And so that is certainly something to be celebrated.
That's great news. It's good to see.
All right, so we'll go ahead and shift to middle school. Reading, I think, is where we left off. But again, seeing very similar trends, even at that master's level, with incredible performance at the highest levels for our students relative to their peers. So then looking at mathematics, we'll start again with that 40,000 foot view just across the grade span on those math STAR exams. I have a couple of footnotes here that I think are important to stop and explain because we do see this significant decline in seventh grade mathematics in particular, and that is a trend that we are accustomed to here in College Station ISD because we do have large numbers of our students who are not participating in the on-grade level assessment due to their advancement through credit by exam and participating in accelerated math courses. And so seventh graders who are taking either an advanced course, who might be taking an eighth grade math STAR or an algebra or a geometry, a few even beyond, are not participating in that particular assessment. In fact, this year we had only 56% of our seventh grade students taking that on-level assessment. Still, though, even with those much smaller numbers of students participating, we had performance a little above the state. Eighth grade is a little different because if students are in eighth grade taking advanced math like geometry, they are also required to take the eighth grade exam because they're not taking an end of course exam like they would be if they were taking Algebra 1. And so those numbers are much higher in terms of the students enrolled in eighth grade taking the on-level assessment. So I always like to take a moment and explain that. It's a little different than you might presume. So looking at mathematics in that same lens of pre and post pandemic, 2019 to 2022, you'll see right away our trends, much like reading, are mirroring the state, however, at higher levels of performance, both passing as well as those higher standards of meets and masters. So you can see there's third grade. And not only did we start higher than the state back in 2019, but we saw a less significant decline than the state did across the board. So then we've got our fifth and sixth grade math, very similar, just in general in terms of a decline, but not as significant as the state, and certainly had a higher baseline starting rate prior to the pandemic. And then we move into those middle school grades where we have the impact of fewer students taking those on-level assessments. But you can see statewide, there was a very significant decline in the approaches level to pre and post-pandemic, and then a lesser extent here in College Station ISD.
I had a question, Dr. Perry. You mentioned the reading academies.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what those instructional coaches are for? Is for the reading academies?
So the instructional coaches may have some involvement with reading academies, but we really have our teachers going through those processes as required.
For reading and math. Is there like a math camp
There
like
is
there's a
not.
reading?
There
Okay.
is not a math academy like there's a reading academy, but we are moving towards, especially at the elementary grade level, a more standardized curriculum for this upcoming school year.
I still think it's interesting, like you said, the kids that were really affected by COVID still moved a lot of people into masters. When did the educational coaches or the instructional coaches begin? Has it been going on for a while?
This is the,
Oh, okay.
I believe this is the third year. However, during the pandemic, the instructional coaches spent much of their time providing the different types of
Right.
instruction. And so I wouldn't say that this is our fourth year of fully implementing
Yeah,
in the
we
way
probably,
they've
this
been
is year
envisioned.
4, so we probably had a year, and then we had pandemic, and so probably starting this year will be our second real, whatever year, where they maybe get to do what their intended purposes. Those folks, I will tell you, those folks, and a multitude of different individuals help fill in the gaps when we had a lot of people out with COVID, or when we were offering the virtual and the on-site. Many of those folks kind of stepped in and served in those daily roles as far as taking on rosters.
All right, with that, we'll shift to science. And the science assessment is administered in grades 5 and 8. And so looking at an overview there, you can see this year's performance relative to the state in each of those grade levels. And then broken down by grade level and mastery level. So science and math actually mirrored each other quite a bit in terms of the state having a more significant decline. We saw a little bit of a decline. I will say, though, we are seeing good growth in science on our MAP assessments. And so while we are seeing a decline here, really not too concerned that that trend would continue based on the progress that we're beginning to see with our students there. Social studies is administered only in grade 8 prior to the high school exam. And so you can see here, right away, that is an area where statewide we see lower rates of passing, and that is historically the case. In fact, you can see here that statewide we actually saw gains in social studies. So reading and social studies are mirroring each other, and then science and math are really mirroring each other in terms of student performance. So it's kind of an interesting phenomena there. Really interesting here to see the growth of the higher levels of standard in terms of our students' performance relative to the state, because we did see some good gains there. So then we'll shift to those end-of-course exams, and this time across the 5 required end-of-course exams, or EOCs, that are administered throughout a student's time in taking high school courses. So we've got the Algebra 1, the Biology, the English 1, English 2, and U.S. History. We'll break those down like we have our other exams, beginning with Algebra 1. And so much like the grades 3-8 math, we saw a decline both at the state level and in district for our students who were passing that Algebra 1 EOC. I do want to note that this includes not only our students enrolled in high school, but any student enrolled in algebra. So this would incorporate those testers that you saw excluded earlier who were taking Algebra 1. Then in biology, a similar trend. It's probably worth noting that the passing standard on biology is very generous, and so we traditionally do see very high rates of passing on that particular exam. And while we did see a slight decline, again, not as significant as those around the state. And then we've got our English 1 and English 2 with a slight decline on English 1, and then same on English 2. The state actually saw a little bit of a gain, but again, we were significantly higher than the state for our baseline prior to the pandemic there. And lastly, we've got our U.S. History end of course exam. Probably also worth noting here that compared to that 8th grade social studies test, the passing standard is significantly different. And so it's not like students magically do much better on the high school exam, but the passing standards are drastically different between those 2 tests. And so you see statewide in the district, those performance levels are very high, despite a little bit of a decline in U.S. history. And so some highlights from the assessment and scores there before we shift into accountability is just important to note. I think that across every single subject and grade level and on all of the end of course exams, our students meet those passing standards at higher rates than the state. Then regarding those trends, the reading and social studies, like we mentioned as we reviewed, we saw that scores actually improved as compared to pre-pandemic, and we continue to significantly outperform our peers around the state. And although we did see some declines in science and mathematics, again, our declines were less significant, and performance continues to be much higher than across the state. We also really want to, just note that those highest levels of performance standards are happening for our students at much higher rates than their peers. And then we are actually in the process now that I think we have the final data file that is accurate of disaggregating that information really more down at the student group level, because that is important to inform our progress and continue to work on strategic plan goal number 2. So know that we'll be providing you all with additional information about that in the coming weeks. So with that, let's talk state accountability. This, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, is the first year that we've had ratings assigned by the state in the last several years since 2019. And so I'm going to attempt to consolidate a 226-page manual on state accountability into one slide. So you're welcome. There are 3 domains in this system.
I told her she had 2 slides, so, right.
We got this. We've got the first domain being student achievement. And so for a district, student achievement incorporates STAR performance as well as college, career, and military readiness, CCMR, and then graduation rates. And so those 3 aspects are combined to give you a domain score in student achievement. The school progress domain actually has 2 methodologies, and the state calculates both of those and then would choose the higher of the 2 for your overall domain score. So within school progress, either we're looking at how our students performed relative to the rate of economic disadvantage, so it's a regression formula, or we're looking at their performance compared to the prior school year, which, as you can imagine, was extremely difficult to calculate this year when we had, I say we, the state especially, had smaller numbers of students participating in that exam. So then,
Molly, an observation on
Absolutely.
that, and correct me, I want to see if I understand this correctly. So if last year a district had significant declines in their performance, had modest gains this year, there's a possibility they would score high in that domain and it would be used in this 70% calculator.
absolutely.
So if a district had a lesser drop during the pandemic, there's less room for school and student progress. Therefore, they can almost, in theory, because there's lots of variables in this, almost be, I don't want to say punished, but have lesser
Less opportunity to show growth.
lesser opportunity to show growth in that particular domain that would be used in their accountability rating,
That
correct?
is accurate.
So, I mean, it might have been better from an accountability standpoint to bottom out last year so we get a real good growth this year to play the game. Is that
Well,
correct?
The good news is that the game is not as important as our students
Absolutely.
having strong academic outcomes. And so while, yes, there may be districts out there
those
that
are all
benefited from the accountability
possibilities
standpoint.
with this particular system. Is that?
Yes.
And if I'm incorrect, tell me.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and then I have another question, because you said it's compared to, or they use those low socioeconomic numbers. So that's, we get those numbers from our free and reduced lunch applications, correct?
Correct.
And last year, we had free lunches for everyone. So how did that affect our free and reduced lunch applications?
So we really worked hard to continue to get those applications in because it
Right.
affects not only accountability, but state comp ed and other
Right.
systems. Obviously, there was less of an incentive for families to complete those applications when free lunch was available to all students. And so I think it is a fair assumption that across the state, the numbers related to economic disadvantage were probably not as accurate as they would have otherwise been. So it is, I guess, fortunate in that manner that the second domain, the school progress, you have an either or. But for us as a district, it was actually more beneficial to use the methodology of economic disadvantage just slightly. I think the score was just slightly higher than with the relative performance.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely. Great question. All right, so back to our 226-page manual in one slide. We've got closing the gaps, and that is the third domain. And so this one is probably the most complex of the 3, where we have 14 student groups that are monitored across achievement, which is going to be reading and math performance on STAR at that middle meets level, along with graduation rates, English language proficiency as measured by the TELPUS exam, and then CCMR, or the career college and military readiness, I'm sorry, college, career, and military readiness. And so each of those 14 groups is evaluated compared to a target performance of which you either meet or you don't meet, and then weighted within those various components. And so ultimately, a district or a campus's overall rating is based on either student achievement or school progress at a weight of 70% and closing the gaps at a weight of 30%. Right, I know, clear as mud. So how did we fare in this particular system? Well, interestingly enough, all three domains were an 89, which was, of course, a B. And so our overall rating calculated also to that 89 out of 100. We also, in 2019, had that same exact rating as a district. And so that is where we are in terms of the rating assigned by the state.
We can't round up.
You get any extra credit?
I mean,
Come on. If they get an 89 in my class, I'm rounding up.
I'll give you
Your
the
grading
commissioner's number.
system probably makes more sense than this one also.
I'm sure it is much more simple. And so here you can see listed our overall ratings across campuses. You interestingly looked at this at a little more detail and found that 2/3 of our campuses, not necessarily from the letter grade perspective, but the numerical number associated with each of those letter grades increased from 2019 to 2022. We did have 3 D campuses in 2019. We have none in this particular year. And so while the overall district rating is the same, we certainly saw movement among our campuses within the system. Another aspect of the system includes distinction designations. So how distinction designations work is that every campus is assigned a comparison group of 40 other campuses from around the state. And so the state is assigning these lists of 40 based upon comparability. So we're looking at do the schools serve the same grade span? Do they have similar overall sizes, similar rates of economic disadvantage, mobility, special education, et cetera. And so within your group of 40 campuses, they are looking at the distinctions you see listed on there with the 4 content areas: comparative academic growth, post-secondary readiness, and closing the gaps, and then ranking those 40 campuses with the top quartile of the 40 receiving a designation. And so you can see here we had 36 total designations, which actually is an increase over our last accountability system in 2019. We had 33 back then. And so while we might note some concerns regarding some of those dips in performance that we saw due to the impact of the pandemic, we actually received the most designations in the area of mathematics. So different ways to look at the system depending on the lens through which you view it. You can find all of this and much, much more about not only College Station ISD, but all of the schools within the state of Texas at texasschools.gov. I think the website is probably working again. Yesterday it was a little overloaded, but that is where the information is available. And with that, I would be happy to answer any additional questions that you might have or receive other comments.
I just want to say, I know with STAR coming back and the great job that everyone had done, I feel like we say it a lot in here, but I don't think we can say it enough, but thank you to all the educators and to the students. There's a lot of anxiety from both of them that comes back with the testing, and getting through that and doing a great job, I think speaks volumes of everybody, students and educators. So thank you so much for all your hard work, and everybody deserves a pat on the back.
Agreed.
And I just have to say that I do see the value in this testing, and I see the value in the results and getting this information. But for me, this is just one area that we look at in our district, and thank goodness there are so many more areas that we look at, and that we don't hang our hat on STAR test results. Because I am glad to see that they're doing well. But again, our teachers do so much more than prepare our kids for the STAR test. So I do see the value, but I see it in a much bigger picture way, not just for our district.
I agree, Ms. Nolan. I reflect back to Friday, and we had a 3-minute video that captured so much more of what our kids accomplished. Nowhere in this system do I see where you get points for the number of National Merit Scholars, or kids scoring perfect on the SAT, or for your vet tech team winning state, or your meets judging team, which we did, that Ms. Stutz did explain to George Kuros what that was, winning a national championship, or both your high school bands making state for the first time. None of those things are captured in this. This is but one piece of the puzzle. Are we cognizant of it and responsible for it? Absolutely. And it's something that we can deduct information we need to make sure that we are providing the best instruction possible. But it is just that one piece of a bigger picture of so much more that is going on with our faculty and staff and our kids.
Well said. I don't have.
Anything else? No? Dr. Perry, we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good report. Way to put that in one slide, though. Very, very impressive. So that will bring us to item E, adjournment, and we will be back at 6:40, I believe.